Thank you. All right, welcome. I'm going to jump right in. Probably not where you expected me to jump right in. This was my introduction to wage theft. As I started to read about the woman there, Lacey T. They used her last name because otherwise people looked up the cheerleaders and harassed them and stalked them. But she signed a contract that had been in place for many, many years for being a cheerleader. They got a very small fee for the entire football season cheerleading. That included 10 games. There were 3 practices a week that they didn't pay her for. She had to do 10 promotional appearances. This basically makes the team look good, charitable events, other things to build corporate goodwill for the team, which is a billion-dollar business. There's really strict rules on how you look, how your hair can be, how you do the makeup, your uniform, which obviously isn't lots of material, but it is expensive. She's not compensated for any of that. And they fine the women money for lots and lots of violations, including things like you have a certain weight, and if you go more than 3 pounds over your weight, you can get fined for that. So they also tell you that you can't be a stripper, you can't post nude pictures of yourself, but you do have to do a swimsuit calendar, which will sell to you cheaply, and then you can resell it to hustle a little bit of money. So this was an interesting case of wage theft. It wasn't quite what I expected as I started to think about it, but I think it has lots of interesting elements to it, because even though there were lots of women on the squad who had been through this contract, she was the only one who sued. Much later, as the suit progressed, 1 other woman joined her. She ended up obviously winning and got a settlement for a lot of the cheerleaders and former cheerleaders. The Raiders restructured the contract going forward, and a whole lot of other teams kind of said, yeah, we do basically the same thing with our cheerleaders. We kind of need to give them a better deal. But at the end of the day, they basically got all of the cheerleaders up to something close to minimum wage. It wasn't a huge breakthrough where you really see the value of the fitness and the ability to dance, to move, to do all the rest of it that the cheerleaders need to do. So this got me interested in wage theft. I hadn't thought about it before, even though I was a criminologist, and I started reading a lot about it. And that's kind of what I wanted to take you through today. This was no doubt aided by my own participation in the Professors Union where I work. I've been on the executive committee. I spent some time on the negotiating team, hammering out a contract for 700 faculty members. I've also been on strike a couple of times. So it was exciting to get the offer. It's really nice to do some international solidarity and to be here today with you all. Thank you very much for inviting me. As an American, I will be talking about wage theft in the United States. When it comes to wage theft, we are a great country. We have really perfected the art of wage theft. We have perfected the art of making much of the economic exploitation legal. We have perfected the art of making it appear that we're enforcing, but really keeping the enforcement agencies defective by design. I hope that this isn't your future, but it can be kind of a cautionary tale about how things unfold if we aren't really careful. So let's start off with the basics. Wage theft is non-payment of money that is due under your contract and under all of the laws that apply to that workplace. Business generally hates the term wage theft. Lots of the literature talks about wage and hour violations, because in the United States, there's a wage and hour division that's part of the Department of Labor that has enforcement responsibilities. So wage and hour violations is the technical term. I'll talk in a minute about why I prefer wage theft. But business kind of says wage theft is bad because it makes it seem like we're doing it on purpose. If it was a mistake, then you would get as much overpay as underpay. And that's not the way this goes. I've been talking to people for years now about wage theft, and they always say, well, what is that? I tell them, I give them some examples, and almost inevitably they tell me, oh yeah, and they give me a story. I'm still waiting for that person who says, yeah, I've been overpaid for years and nobody noticed, right? It doesn't happen. most of the time, even if you're not familiar with the word, people know the experience. I've been amazed at how many people could give me an example of wage theft. I would say I worked for a pizza place when I was between college and grad school, and they just didn't pay me for all the hours I worked. And it was a little hard to keep track of hours between two jobs, but when I found out, I had a hard time confronting my boss because I depended on him for a schedule, for enough hours to support me, and basically to play nice so that my two jobs didn't conflict with each other. So it took a whole lot of pay periods of kind of chiding him about underpaying me before he kind of relented and I got back up to my full salary. Not any reimbursement for past theft, but just, getting the crappy pay that I was due. And this is kind of what we see throughout. Sarah was the other cheerleader who eventually joined Lacey T's wage theft. And, her comment was that they keep telling you you're lucky to have this job. There are dozens of women who want to be cheerleaders who don't make the squad. Consider yourself lucky to have a job, but that really doesn't give them the right to create a bogus contract, to underpay people and exploit people. And we recognize that the cheerleader is a nice platform so you can launch personal fitness, you can become an Instagram influencer. There's a lot of things you can do with the cachet of having been a cheerleader, but ultimately still that doesn't mean you need to subsidize $1 billion corporation that is into sports, and you should ultimately still get your due. What we tend to see here, and a couple of forms that it takes in the big picture, we increasingly have franchises all over the place. It's funny wandering around Oslo and being familiar with so many of the companies and businesses that work here, but you create a franchise. The corporate office wants lots of money. They want to become a bigger corporation. They set unrealistic requirements, especially for labor costs as a chunk of revenue. The franchise tries desperately to meet all of these strict criteria and eventually kind of says, well, let's just do something illegal, right? We cut food costs, we cut worker safety, we cut consumer protections, and we cheat our employees. And then ultimately, we have wage theft. The worker tries to do something about it. We limit under law. They can only sue the franchise, which is their direct employer. The direct employer doesn't have that much money, so oftentimes they can't recover very much. The corporate headquarters that is raking in a lot of this money, appropriating it, is really kind of off the hook. They're not seen as the direct employer. They didn't require wage theft. They actually put out a piece of paper that the franchise signs saying you're going to obey all the laws. The franchise says, okay, we'll sign that. And then the worker really kind of gets stuck. We have a whole lot of this with outsourcing as well. It's the same basic model. I have a store and I need trucks unloaded. Rather than hiring my own employees, I outsource. And surprise, surprise, the lowest bidder is the lowest bidder because they rip off their employees. The store says, hey, you signed an agreement saying you were going to abide by all the laws. You didn't do that. But anyways, I'm not your employer. The outsourcing company was. If you're ripped off, you sue them. But hey, this is a disposable shell company. So we just kind of do this for a little while, siphon off all the money. When we get sued, we say, we're bankrupt, sorry, you're screwed. And then we keep the same office building, the same phone number, the same address. We flip the name, and it all of a sudden becomes a new corporation, and we keep doing the same game. This is one of the few areas with corporate law where you can kind of be a snake and shed your skin, and the law recognizes you as a different snake. Right? For most other purposes, we would say, yeah, that's the same snake, just in a different skin. We change our clothes and we're the same person. But for corporations, you can have the same group of people, but they change their skin, change their suit. They're different legally. I have a whole lot of reasons why we should care about wage theft. The first one ultimately is that this is a theft. The deal in the labor market is that you trade your labor and your skills for a wage. You accrue that minute by working, even if you only get a paycheck every couple of weeks. Ultimately, if somebody withholds part of that pay, that is a fraud. That is a theft. It happens over time. It's not somebody breaking into your house, confronting you on the street and taking your money. It's a little bit more polite than that, but it is still a theft of what is rightfully yours. Lots of times there's an element of extortion there too. If you complain, I am going to fire you, right? You have to take this as part of your job. Part of your job involves working for less pay than you really do. And in that case, there's an extortion that goes with it. There's a coercion behind this that we need to recognize. This impacts workers because they have less. We know that the stress from that results in substance abuse and mental health problems. Lots of people get stressed out when they're getting ripped off and they don't feel like they can do anything about it. That's a crappy situation to be in, especially if you're living paycheck to paycheck. That doesn't necessarily mean only poor people. Lots of middle-class people also live paycheck to paycheck on the edge. So that little bit that's skimmed adds a lot to the economic stress of the family or of the couple or just the individual. It also definitely undermines communities because that person is investing, spending less in the community. And it directly promotes inequality because it's the workers who are getting screwed, and that money is going up to people who already have a lot of capital because they've been setting up businesses. It's an unjust enrichment on top of the theft. As you look for allies to talk about wage theft, some people in government kind of get it. I'm very much in accord with a lot of the concerns that Dave just mentioned. Lots of times government pretends to enforce the law. We want a veneer, a facade of enforcement, but really do nothing. But you can find people in government who are concerned because ultimately this deprives government of tax revenue. If I'm supposed to get $1,000 in wages and I get $850, there's less taxes on that that go off to the government. If I keep getting wage theft for years, that's a substantial amount of money that I'm out and that the government is also out. If because of wage theft I fall below certain thresholds and I go to government for welfare benefits, that's more money out of government coffers that need to go into mine, again, to subsidize a corporation that's probably already profitable. We recognize that there's some organized crime groups that set up shell companies and do wage theft. You can talk to them about that. I'm a little iffy on this point because, yes, it does do some, but the focus should really be on the fact that most of these are legitimate businesses that engage in wage theft. We'll talk later about Walmart, but a lot of regular companies do wage theft as part of the business model, so I don't want to get too distracted by kind of wage theft by organized crime. Your partners are also honest businesses that are paying what they should to employees. Ultimately, if I am engaging in wage theft, I'm paying you less, I'm paying less in taxes, I can sell my product at a cost and undercut all of the legitimate businesses. Enforcement is really important because if I'm engaging in wage theft and I'm beating you on price, you either go out of business or you adapt and you do wage theft if I don't get caught. So when I can continue to engage in wage theft and put a lot of pressure on your business, you see your business shrinking because everyone's coming to me and nobody's doing anything about me, then you're going to engage in wage theft too. You see it's a clear signal, right? I need to do this to keep my employees in, even if they're getting less money, and it becomes a standard industry practice. You can see in the garment industry, when the Department of Labor did 1,500 investigations, it's a pretty good sample, 93% of them were engaged in wage theft. They even had it rigged so that the software generated falsified records, right? Let's not go and change everybody's hours. We'll just get a computer program to crawl through and subtract, 10, 15, 20% from everybody's paycheck before the paychecks are spit out. So that's that intentionality, right? We talked about that earlier. This is something that people think about doing. It is deliberate behavior. Wage theft is also going to victimize unions. If my union dues come out of the size of my paycheck, then there's less going to the union because my paycheck isn't what it's supposed to be. Even if I am not union, wage theft depresses my wage. It makes me more desperate for work at any cost. So I am going to be out there in the labor market undermining somebody who's trying to deal with collective rates and standard rates for a field. The other problem that we have is that everyone knows employee theft. Everybody knows that employees steal. It becomes kind of something that lots of workers or lots of businesses talk about. It's something out there in the industry a lot, how kind of workers cheat by punching in and then having coffee, too many bathroom breaks, there's all sorts of jokes about it. But nobody knows wage theft, and it makes it seem really one-sided. It seems like the employers aren't doing anything wrong, but they are the poor victims in all of this. Right? They need more labor regulations to make up for all of the bad things that employees are doing in the workplace, and we don't have that counterpoint. Wage theft becomes invisible. Right? You do a Google search, I get 22 million results for wage theft, but I get 5 times more for employee theft. And this leads to the situation in the United States where Walmart, during a period of about 6 years in the early 2000s, had $1 billion worth of settlements for wage theft claims. At the same time, they had a woman who's a retiree. She was taking care of a disabled son. And she would, as she closed the store and cleaned up at night, open packages of cookies and crackers and eat them. And they caught her on camera, and she said, "Yeah, I've been doing this for years." So even though it was a couple bucks per package of cookies and crackers, when she said she'd been doing it for years, they said, "That's a lot of money. This is a felony. We're going to charge you with a serious crime for doing this." So this is kind of the imbalance that happens when we're not paying attention to it and actively putting this idea out there that this is theft. It's not a polite term for having your paycheck lighter than it should be. It is theft. Let's talk about it like that. Let's talk about the criminal law, even though there's some limits to that, but let's talk about it as a crime and a social wrong in not so polite terms. I have lots and lots of examples. So this is to kind of give you some idea of the sweep of this. The basic one is that you don't get paid for all the hours you work if you're an hourly employee. As we've seen, we have computer programs that are set up just to skim hours right off the top. We also find that this happens a lot to retail and service employees who work erratic schedules. I work for 2 weeks, but different hours every day, and then 2 weeks later I get a paycheck. How do I know that all of the hours are actually accounted for? It's kind of a crazy life. We all have a lot more going in, and this is part of the conditions that allow it to happen, especially when workplaces make it hard for employees to check up on back and see their punch cards, see other things that are done to create the business records. Lots of employers will withhold a final paycheck, basically say, "You quit on me, so screw you, I'm going to keep this, come back, if you dare." Withholding tips from lots of employees that depend on it, especially now that we just stick our credit card in and the tip goes onto the credit card. It's not left on the table for somebody like in the old days. And also there are times when paychecks bounce. So if you do this enough, yes, people slowly leave, but you can kind of stretch it out and maybe make 5 pay periods into 4 paychecks and end up kind of keeping everyone off balance. Overtime rates, and I understand you have a special rate for Sunday. In the United States, after 40 hours, it's supposed to be time and a half. Lots of times employers don't do that. You worked 45 hours, but it's just times your regular rate. There are certain categories of salaried employees that are exempt from overtime requirements, so we try to play around with who is exempt and tell you that you are exempt from overtime even if you aren't. We also have a really low dollar threshold for who is an exempt employee. It was supposed to be really middle management and above, but we haven't updated that number for inflation now in about 2 decades, so now more and more working class people are exempt from overtime. You can give people a slight pay bump and get them over that. They're exempt from overtime, and then you can work them as much as you like. We find lots of people trying to structure a business so that an employee technically has a different employer for doing the same thing. We see this especially in restaurants. Somebody will own 2 restaurants, and they'll say, well, these are 2 businesses. You work 30 hours for one and 30 hours for another, but you don't get overtime because these are different jobs. right? We try to divide up the jobs, so one day you're in the kitchen and one day you are doing something else. So these are different positions, so the overtime doesn't accrue. We also find people just trying to take arbitrary start dates and times. Your work week isn't Monday to Monday. It really started Tuesday at 4:30 in the afternoon and goes for 7 days. And during those 7 days, you didn't work more than 40 hours. We have a lot of minimum wage violations. We have a really, really low minimum wage in the United States, but we still find ways to pay people less for it. There's a lot of people who do piecework, and the schedule gets set so that if you really, really hustle, you can get up to a minimum wage, and the fear is that if you fall below that, you'll get less. It's illegal to set piecework that goes below the minimum wage, but lots of employers still try. Lots of times they simply pay people less. Say that's the prevailing rate, that's what you want, take it or leave it. We have lots of unpaid time that people are at work. You're supposed to get a paid break, but we've deliberately understaffed, so we're busy. So hey, we kind of need you on the floor, keep hustling. Those breaks that you were supposed to get, you're just working through now. We increasingly see people who have to show up an hour before the shift and do some work, and then they clock on. Or you clock out, and then you stay around until the job is done. We're only paying you for a certain number of hours, but the work extends well beyond that. And increasingly, we want to be able to deliberately understaff, but we want you on call in case we get busy. So you start at 10, but show up at 8:30. Sit around, maybe you can do something during that time, but be dressed and ready to go. And if we're busy, you can clock in and get a little bit extra. There's a whole lot of unpaid time that, again, is special situations. These are part of contract. Sometimes they're part of law. Changing in and out of clothing, especially protective clothing, can sometimes take a while. The employer doesn't want to have you change into your hazardous materials gear on the clock, even though you need it for work. So we'll try to have the clock start once you are all ready to go. That changing is on your time. In the United States, this is doffing and donning. There's a whole long series of requirements about this. This is one of the areas that's legitimately complicated, but basically businesses say, we're not going to pay you unless basically you force us to. It's not like there's mistakes made with this where people are getting paid to change when they don't really need that time or that money. Waiting to go through security is another big one. Amazon warehouses especially. They lost the Supreme Court case recently, but when you get off your shift at the warehouse, everyone needs to go through to security to make sure that you're not walking out and stealing something. This could result in backups so that employees were there for an extra hour, but they weren't paid for that because they were off the clock. They said, this is crazy. So Amazon could have staggered shifts, so not everybody in the warehouse got off at the same time. They could have opened up a second screening station. They did neither, and they won the case, because even though you have to go through security, it wasn't technically a requirement of work in the eyes of the Supreme Court, so you as an employee are just kind of screwed. You wait around on your own time waiting to go out. And the other area is transportation to and from a job site, especially where you check in somewhere, maybe get equipment, and then go out to a remote site. Again, this is kind of usually covered by law or contract, but the employers would really love to pay you once you hit the job site, not for all the time getting your gear and the trucks and actually going out to where you need to be. The use of independent contractors is the huge one, and one of the ways that we have made wage theft staggeringly legal. There's a whole lot of technical requirements in the US to be an independent contractor versus an employee, but basically, if there's any doubt, we're going to set you up as an independent contractor, because then none of the labor requirements apply to you. We don't have to worry about your taxes. And we can try to get away with things like saying, here's the job and here's the amount of money you get. If it takes you longer and you fall below minimum wage, that's not our problem, because we told you what the job was and how much you get for it. The gig economy kind of apps are some of the really big offenders here. In the United States, we've just kind of done hands-off in most cases. There's a couple of cases in California where they've said, no, this person is employee. You're telling them what to wear when they show up. You're making them use materials that the company says. There's a script where you greet people when you start your job. There's another script when you leave. In between, you do things in a certain order. That's enough control over the workplace that these people are actually employees. But that tends to be really unusual. And most often, we just kind of, again, let labor fall through and allow independent contractors and freelancing. And we even seem to make it seem like a good thing. The United States is probably better about this, but this is now freedom, right? I can work when I want. I can take the jobs when I want. It's really romantic to be out on my own without, kind of an employer. Even though, again, it's a really hard hustle to keep yourself in these gigs. A lot of them are low paid and exploitative. We still try to kind of turn up the freedom idea of it and entice people into it. We increasingly have internships that basically replace a paid employee. You're doing secretarial work, photocopy work, you're doing grunt work. You're not really doing anything of educational value like the internship should really do. We also have a number of instances where kind of unofficially you are supposed to give a kickback to your boss. You will get a paycheck for all of the hours and it will be above minimum wage, but then you go to the bank and cash it and give your boss back some money. Lots of times you're supposed to give your employees a couple of weeks notice, up to a month of notice that they're fired, that things are done. There's a severance payment. We just don't do any of that. You're fired today, don't come back tomorrow. That income that you thought you would have, that's not there. And oftentimes, again, it's done in a way that will classify you so that you can't get any kind of worker compensation, unemployment claims, or other things that would support you after you leave. Lots of times, part of wage theft is not contributing to a pension, so that the pension is underfunded. Lots of pensions keep some track of the amount that you've contributed. You get points for contributing certain amounts, certain number of years, but all of that falls back, so there's less money coming back out later. In the United States, we have to pay ridiculous amounts for our health care. Lots of times that employer contribution isn't done. Employees go to get health care and then find that they're shut off, that they don't have the insurance, and then you get hit with the full weight of a medical bill, which again can be really staggering. There's also a lot of non-reimbursement for things that are required for the company. We need you to go to a conference, but we're not going to reimburse you for the conference fee or for mileage or for anything else that day. Some of the other aspects are kind of negotiated, but they might tell you when you start, oh yes, your uniforms are provided, then you find out that they're not, or that there's a laundry charge that tends to be really excessive. But there's a lot of ways, again, that work can kind of scrape back part of your salary in ways that are either shady, ethically questionable, or downright illegal. And finally, we have a whole lot of illegal deductions. People will say, you were here for 10 hours, but you did crappy work, so we're only going to pay you for 9. There are supposed to be disciplinary procedures in place to deal with that. You don't take it off the top in somebody's wage. Lots of times when the cash register is a little bit short, it's assumed that you stole, so we'll take it out of your paycheck. That is illegal in most states, but lots of places still do it. Trying to charge you for broken equipment, spilled materials, you dropped some plates, you did something in the lab, you broke specialized equipment. Again, there should be other ways to do this. You can't take it out of an employee's paycheck. Lots of times deductions are done without any kind of notice. You just find that your paycheck is short, and there is just kind of a cryptic deduction or something else so that you don't know what it actually is. You have a hard time finding out why they took money out. There's not documentation that something was broken or something was inappropriate, and you don't have an appeals process to challenge it. You're just going into your boss saying that's not fair, but there's no formal way to create a record so that you can appeal it. Your boss has a conflict of interest. He or she profits when they don't give you money. and then you say that's not fair and try to challenge it, they decide whether or not their earlier decision was fair. So you end up not getting a fair hearing over the deductions. We also forget that even legitimate deductions can't take you below the minimum wage. And that was probably part of the problem with the cheerleaders. Not only is it kind of questionable some of the things that they were trying to charge the women for in terms of fines, but if you set up a whole system with lots of fines that people know about and you end up taking back all of their paycheck, that's illegal. There should still be a minimum wage there after you deduct all of the fines. So we have some questions about what we can do about all of this. And I would certainly share some of David's concern here about the scope of the criminal law and the prosecutions that go along with that. The criminal law, though, does express a certain moral sentiment and disapproval of conduct. And once you start prosecuting people for wage theft, there's a different reaction to it. One of the problems we find is that prosecutors are very cautious. They want to know that their prosecution is going to stick and result in a guilty plea, but wage theft presents kind of a weird way of charging things. It doesn't quite work with most of our larceny or theft statutes because it happens to lots of people over time. So the prosecutor says, well, do I charge 80 crimes of $9 each? That seems kind of crazy. Is it by the employee, right? We have 10 employees who have all had $72 stolen for them, so is this 10 charges? Is this 8 crimes because it was 8 pay periods? Is this one crime lumping everything together? If there's not certainty, then the prosecutor is going to be really cautious. They would kind of like to know what the courts will do with this. Having a statute that lays out the exact elements of the offenses gives them much more confidence in charging that they can make the case, and it's not going to be kicked out because the judge is going to say, no, 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 that's not one big crime. You've got all of these people here, and you've got all of these pay periods. We also have some enforcement through civil suits. In the United States, whatever you can prove you recovered, or whatever you can prove was taken from you within the statute of limitations, you can recover that plus 100%, then there's some attorney's fees out of it. The problem is that attorneys don't tend to take cases involving just a couple of people at small workplaces. They want a big workplace with lots of employees and lots of money to make it worth their time, so you tend to have lots of smaller businesses that basically are unaccountable through the civil system. We also have the problem in California that 83% of successful wage suits, so I was ripped off, I challenged somebody in court, I provided the documentation, the court says, yes, you were the victim of wage theft, you deserve money back. In 83% of those cases, there was no money that was collected because the company went out of business and they no longer existed. They just shut down and pulled up stakes and disappeared. So although this is important kind of practically and theoretically, it also does pose some real limitations in terms of enforcement. It's good to have a system like this in place, but again, it's not a gold standard. There are some regulations that are helpful. Lots of times they're hard to get into place because companies oftentimes do push back on your regulators. But having a basic law in place that allows a penalty wage if you haven't paid your wages within 3 days of when you were supposed to. We should also make penalties for having a charge against you in court, some kind of settlement, and not paying that within 90 days. Your pay stub here, little part that goes along with your paycheck, can be a real useful document. You need to go into court and prove that you worked a certain amount and didn't get paid for it. Lots of details of the pay stub can be helpful in documenting what you were paid for. Then it's still up to you to prove that you did more than that or that something was wrong with that, but at least you have down your employer's version of events there. In the US, lots of places limit you to 2 years of wage theft. So if I work for somebody for 3 years, then they basically, I can only sue them for the last 2 years of wage theft, not all 3. There's no interest that accrues on that settlement. The the 100% penalty, but nothing else above that. And we should be allowing suits against corporate headquarters, the people who are outsourcing. Allow folks to go after the deep pockets. If I can sit in my corporate headquarters and kind of dictate structures that make wage theft more profitable or more probable, and sit back and rake in money and not be accountable for it, I'm going to keep doing that. Even if the franchisees keep getting dinged, even if my outsourcers keep getting in trouble with the law, I'm ultimately the source of the problem, and nothing is coming back and sticking to me. Employees are increasingly using apps to log in when they get to work. They can look up and see how many hours they've worked and what their paycheck is likely to be. It would be really nice, too, if there was some kind of audit trail. So there was a flag that went up and said, hey, you logged in this number of hours, but somebody just changed that, so you're getting paid less. So you would be able to deal with it, know it, screenshot it as documentary evidence. Making sure that the law is really clear about what is an appropriate deduction, what are the scopes of appropriate deductions, that they need to be clearly explained. You can't just kind of say fine, 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 and without saying what they're for. Make sure that the employer has documentation, that there's an appeals process, that they give you notice of the appeals process while you're getting fined and having those deductions. Government enforcement is a real problem. A lot of these agencies, the wage and hour divisions in the United States, are defective by design. A couple of states don't have investigatory power. So if you call them and say, I'm the victim of wage theft, they can help you as an individual fix it, but they can't go out to the workplace and say, does this happen to anybody else? We know certain sectors of industry have a lot more wage theft than others, but they can't go and investigate them. They can only respond to individuals who call, right? That's defective by design. That's meant to be a show of regulatory enforcement that doesn't amount to much. So we need to do things like that. Government can work with the honest businesses so that they don't get put out. Again, there's kind of that mutual interest there that helps a little bit. Obviously, identifying high-risk industries. You probably have some sense of this from the work that you do, who you compete against. Oftentimes, it's known. There's just no enforcement and follow-up. And trying to make sure, again, that there's kind of well-funded agencies that are looking out for workers. And again, this is hard because everyone likes smaller government. That's part of smarter regulation. Certainly, government can play a role in educating businesses, trying to reduce those mistakes that don't really happen, but at least putting them on notice so it makes it more likely that any violations are intentional because they have been told. We can also do public notices of violations to try to shame people, and obviously help out educating workers, especially ones who aren't protected by a union. There's a lot that unions can do too, not only educating workers, but all of the upcoming students. And this is particularly kind of by industry. Every industry tends to have its own little scam, its own way to skim wages or exploit people that's kind of on the verges of the law or outright illegal. But making sure people know about these so it's kind of industry specific. What do you do to complain? Who do you complain to? What does the paperwork look like? Is there anyone who can help you fill it out? Protecting workers who complain, because lots of times somebody will complain and they'll get fired, and then nobody else wants to complain. So we need to protect the people who are leading the charge and saying, hey, this is unfair, you're ripping us off, make this right. Obviously making attorneys available and trying to survey people in different areas of industry to find out their experiences. Sometimes it goes on for so long that people take it for granted that that's the way things work. That's kind of one of the shocking things about this. So once in a while you kind of need to ask them, because if you just say, hey, is there any kind of criminal or illegal activity going on? It's like, no, that's the way we've been doing it for years. So we can also try to work to hold agencies accountable when they don't enforce the law. Sometimes this, again, is a public shaming. Sometimes this is private meetings to try to increase enforcement. Trying to forge those alliances with honest businesses who can also sometimes have a little bit more clout to challenge government to do better. There's lots of community groups that some workers will be in, especially low-paid workers, immigrant groups, try to find out where the folks are. They're also hearing a lot of stories about the struggles in the workplace. They can be good allies. And in the United States, there's a small number of worker centers to help out non-union workers who don't have that union infrastructure. But that can be really helpful because then there's not a large pool of people who are getting ripped off, who are resentful about union wages and union conditions. You're trying to advocate for them and bring them up and try to make sure that everybody is taken care of. So the conclusions. I realize I've also gone a minute or so beyond, only about 4 more slides. Part of our concern is treating wage theft for legal forms of exploitation. So this is somebody down in Brazil. It was actually posted on Reddit with the future of work as a question mark. But this guy is delivering meals from a restaurant that he doesn't work for. And he's doing it through an app that he doesn't work for. And he's riding a bike that he doesn't own, that he kind of rents through part of the sharing economy. Right, so we have a worker with absolutely no assured rights and not even an employer. So obviously no union there to protect him either. And that's a lot of the concern about the way we're moving with the independent contractors and the rollback of regulations. There's a whole lot of different things we should be concerned about that are kind of legal wage suppression. In the US, we had Silicon Valley. They just decided that they would not hire each other's current employees. And normally if you hire somebody away, you offer them a better salary to come with you. So oftentimes employees would move around, but that was inflating the salary. Apple was having a hard time keeping billions of dollars in the bank, so was Pixar and all of the others. So they needed to kind of clamp down worker salary. We increasingly in the United States are seeing non-compete agreements. Jimmy Donn teaches me how to make a sandwich, and I can't work for another restaurant within 100 miles for a year. I work for a camp counselor, and they say, well, you taught me how to be a camp counselor. You can't go to work for another camp within 50 miles for the next 2 years. Right? That drives down wages. It means that you, as somebody who signed one of these, only have limited options to go back. There's a lot of anti-union activities. We were talking over lunch the other day about all of the industries out there to break unions. When we negotiated the professor's contract for a couple of years, we had somebody whose specialty was union breaking. He didn't break us, but he definitely played hardball. We still have unpleasant things to say about him many, many years later. So I guess I would leave with the thought that even though wage theft is a new term, lots of people know what's going on. If you talk to people out there, they often know that something is wrong with the paycheck. The problem is that they can't really do anything about it. And basically, as we find workers who are desperate, who are marginalized, who don't feel like they're part of anything, that they're not protected, they feel like this is part of the condition of work. That yes, I don't get what I'm promised, but this is kind of the economy rigged against me and I just have to take it. And that tends to be the problem that we really need to work against and struggle against. So workers know that it's happening. They don't feel like they can stop it. On the other side of things, employers have a feeling that they're not going to be held accountable. Nobody's going to do anything and nobody's care, so they can get away with it, and so they will, because it's more money in their pocket. So thank you very much. I hope that this doesn't happen to you.